So today I want to do an overview of the Rogue class in Diablo 4. And the Rogue is going to have a good mix of melee and ranged abilities, being able to have two dual-wielded melee weapons and a ranged weapon equipped at the same time. And the Rogue is going to fill in that stealthy, agile class archetype. And the Rogue's main resource is going to be energy that regens itself over time. And the Rogue's going to be a little bit different because they have much less ways to affect their regeneration of their energy than most other classes have, primarily because their basic skills don't regenerate energy just from using them. Now, the Rogue's unique class mechanic is going to be a specialization system. And you're going to unlock these different specs by completing a quest line with a Rogue faction in the open world of Diablo 4. There's going to be 3 of these quest lines, 3 factions, and 3 different specs you get to choose between, and you only get to have one of these specs active at a time. And the first spec you unlock at level 15 is combo points, and this adds a combo point meter, which is essentially adding an additional resource to your rogue. And your basic attacks will now generate combo points, and certain skills will now consume combo points for additional effects. And all of your skills in the skill tree will tell you if they have additional effects by utilizing combo points. And if a skill can consume combo points to get additional benefits, these benefits will increase with the more combo points it uses. And you'll be able to store 3 combo points at a time, and these combo points are stored on you as an additional resource instead of being stored on a specific enemy. Then at level 20, you can unlock Inner Sight, and you attack marked enemies to fill up your Inner Sight gauge. When it's full, you gain unlimited energy for 4 seconds. So this is kind of adding another resource to the rogue where random enemies will be marked, and if you go attack those enemies, you'll start filling up this gauge, and once it's filled, you just have completely unlimited energy for 4 seconds, which would obviously allow you to put out some massive burst damage. And then at level 30, you can unlock Preparation, and with Preparation, every 100 energy you spend reduces your ultimate's cooldown by 4 seconds. Using an ultimate skill resets the cooldowns of your other skills. So this is actually a pretty unique effect because in Diablo 4, cooldown reduction is much harder to get, and cooldown reduction that affects your ultimates is even harder to get. There's actually not a lot of things in the game that reduce your ultimate cooldowns. So having Preparation on a rogue is going to be pretty strong. And just from an initial glance, I think Preparation seems to be the strongest out of the 3, but it's also going to depend on what type of build you're using because there are some really strong effects on legendary and unique pieces of gear later on in the game that would make Preparation just ridiculously strong. And the rogue skills are going to be split between 6 different categories, being basic, core, agility, subterfuge, imbuement, and ultimates. And just like all the other classes of Diablo 4, you can mix and match any abilities from the first 5 categories, but you're only able to use 1 ultimate at a time. So to start off, we have basic skills. Now these are going to work a little bit differently on rogues because, like I mentioned, using your basic skills doesn't give you any of your main resource. Basically, with every other class, using your basic skills will regenerate you some of your main resource. But with the rogue, this isn't how basic skills work. But at a baseline, these basic skills are more for either applying some type of negative effect to an enemy, giving you some type of buff, or being a filler spell. So an example is Invigorating Strike, melee attack an enemy dealing damage and increasing your energy regeneration by 20% for 3 seconds. Now this is actually the only basic skill that directly ties into your energy regeneration. All the other basic skills either apply a debuff or give you some other buff. This one does basically the same thing. It gives you a buff. This one just increases your resource generation. And an upgrade is damaging a crowd controlled or injured enemy with Invigorating Strikes increases its energy regeneration bonus to 30% instead of 20%. So just more energy regeneration. And with how a lot of the other skills for the rogue work, you can have this up basically 100% of the time. And I think this is probably going to be one of the most used basic skills because just getting a massive increase to your energy regen is going to be massive for pretty much any build. And then next up, we have core skills, which are going to make up some of your strongest skills. And most builds are going to be somewhat built around one of the core skills, and they're all going to have an energy cost. So an example is Barrage, energy cost of 30, lucky chance of 20%. Unleash a barrage of 5 arrows that expand outwards, each dealing damage. Each arrow has a 20% chance to ricochet off off an enemy up to 1 time. Ricochets deal 40% of the arrow's base damage. So like I mentioned at the start of the video, the rogue is going to have a lot of ranged and melee attack, and there's definitely going to be builds that are either full melee or full ranged. And this is definitely going to be a pretty popular core skill for ranged builds, because it does seem like there's a lot of really good legendary effects built around Barrage. And an upgrade for this is Barrage's ricochet chance is increased to 100% for arrows that damage a vulnerable enemy or critically strike any enemy. So now once you get some more stats, once you can apply vulnerable more easily, and once you have some higher crit rate, this barrage is just going to be bouncing around everywhere, hitting tons of different enemies. And next up we have agility skills, and these are going to be focused around movement, either allowing you to just move around quicker in any scenario, or even allowing you to jump around to enemies in combat. And an example is Shadow Step, 9-second cooldown, lucky at chance of 100%, become unstoppable, and quickly move through the shadows to stab your victim from behind, dealing damage. You gain 50% increased movement speed for 2 seconds afterward. So a very strong movement skill on a pretty low cooldown. Also makes you unstoppable, which is just incredibly strong. You can't be CC'd at all when unstoppable, and it does deal some decent damage based off of the scaling I've seen. So even though this category is mainly focused on moving around quicker, a lot of these skills do deal some pretty decent damage. And an upgrade for this is damaging an enemy with Shadow Step increases your critical strike chance against them by 8% for 3 seconds. So now this movement ability is also going to be increasing your damage on the target you use it on by quite a bit. And next up we have Subterfuge Skills, and these are primarily going to be focused around some type of utility, whether it be a trap or a stealth effect. And an example is Concealment, 20-second cooldown, vanish from sight, gaining an advanced form of stealth for 4 seconds that will not be removed by taking damage. Concealment also makes you unstoppable, grants 25% movement speed, and allows you to move freely through enemies for its duration. Using an attack during Concealment will break Concealment. So this is basically just a stealth that makes you move quicker, gives you unstoppable so you can't be CC'd, and you don't even get taken out of this when taking damage. The only way this effect will end is after the duration is over, or if you attack an enemy. So this is going to be an incredibly strong utility skill, and is one of those skills that's just very typical of a rogue. And an upgrade is you gain 40 energy when you enter Concealment. So now it's a pretty big energy regeneration effect, 20-second cooldown baseline, and giving you 40 energy every time you use it is going to also make it into a bit of a DPS cooldown. And next up we have Imbuments. Now Imbuments are used to add an additional element onto specific attacks. So not all skills for the rogue can actually be imbued. It will say on them if they're imbuable, but these Imbuments are going to be incredibly strong for any ability that you can put them on, because they not only add some additional damage or additional effects, but whatever elements you're adding to that weapon, it will also cause that element's effects. So if you put frost on a weapon, it will start to chill targets. And an example is Shadow Imbuement, 9-second cooldown, lucky at chance of 33%, imbue your weapons with festering shadows. Your next 2 imbuable skills deal shadow damage and affect enemies for 6 seconds. Infected enemies explode on death, dealing damage to all surrounding enemies. If the infection expires before the enemy dies, it will deal damage just to that enemy instead of in an AoE. So with this, you're applying shadow to your next 2 skill uses that can be imbuable, and these skills are going to infect enemies, making them explode on death, or just taking a chunk of damage if they don't explode. And since this is now shadow damage, this can now interact for anything that would normally affect shadow damage. So there can be quite a lot of synergies with just changing the damage you're dealing to a different element. And an upgrade of this is you have a 25% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies infected by shadow imbuement. And injured enemies are just low health enemies. I think it's below 30% health. So now you're just going to have a massively increased critical strike chance against low enemies, and this is also going to help with killing off those enemies, getting that big AoE damage. And then finally we have our ultimate skills. These are going to be long cooldown skills that are very strong, but again, you can only use 1 at a time. And also, as we went over with one of the rogue specializations, the rogues do seem to have quite a lot of ways to affect their ultimates in some way, and they seem to be one of, if not the only classes that have big ultimate cooldown reduction effects in in their kit. And an example is Shadow Clone, cooldown of 60 seconds. Your shadow mimics your actions for 15 seconds. Your shadow deals 60% of your damage. You basically create a mimic of yourself that does everything you do for 15 seconds, and it deals 60% of the damage you're dealing. And since it's just mimicking your attacks, this can potentially do more than 60% damage, but it should also be able to apply other effects. Like if you apply a CC to an enemy, this should be copying you to just use that attack, so it should apply that CC as well. There's a lot of crazy interactions that you can usually do with skills like this. And an upgrade is you are unstoppable for 5 seconds after casting Shadow Clone. So that's very strong. You're now completely unCCable for at least the first 5 seconds, so you can do quite a lot of burst after using your ultimate. The rogue does seem to have quite a lot of unstoppable effects already, but that's going to be very good because it makes rogues very sticky and very hard to keep off you. And there is one last category called the Capstones. Now this doesn't house any active skills, but you get to choose one of these very strong passive effects. And an example is Exposure. It's a lucky hit effect. Dealing direct damage to an enemy affected by a trap skill has up to a 25% chance to reduce the active cooldowns of your trap skills by 20%, drop a cluster of exploding stun grenades that deal damage, and stun enemies for 0.5 seconds. So this is obviously going to be an incredibly strong effect if you're using traps or going for a full trap build, which I think is probably actually going to be a thing. There are some very strong trap skills within the rogue and some very strong effects that you can use with those traps, Exposure being one of them. Now this is a lucky hit chance, and once you get into the end game, you're going to start to progress your Paragon boards. Now I don't want to go over all the information of all the Paragon boards. I primarily just want to go over the legendary nodes on each one of these legendary boards, and this will give you a good idea of what that Paragon board is focused around. So first off, we have Cheap Shot. You deal 5% increased damage for each nearby enemy that is crowd controlled up to 25%. And again, the rogue has a lot of crowd controlling effects. So if you're using a build that has a lot of CC in it, you can get a lot of increased damage from this node. Then we have Cunning Stratagem. Your non-damage combo point bonuses are increased by 33% when you spend 3 combo points. Now I know we didn't really go over any of the effects of what combo points actually give you, but these basically just increase the effects of whatever skills they're being used on. So for instance, for core skills, we went over Barrage, and if you use combo points with Barrage, it increases the damage and increases the amount of arrows fired, and this would just be increasing those effects. And combo points are primarily used for core skills. I don't think any other skills of any other categories can actually consume combo points. And then we have Deadly Ambush. You deal 22.5% increased critical strike damage to enemies affected by your trap skills. So as I went over when talking over that Capstone skill, there's going to be some very strong trap builds. And then we have Eldritch Bounty. When you attack with an imbued skill, you gain 20% resistance and 20% increased damage for that imbuement element for 6 seconds. So this effect is actually a little bit weird because you're actually gaining a lot of increased resistance to the imbuement element you're actually using. So if you use Shadow Imbuement, you get 20% resistance to Shadow for 6 seconds. And I think the base cooldown of imbuments were 9 seconds. So you can have this up majority of the time, and you're just going to be gaining increased damage with that imbued element as well. So maybe you'd want to create a build that has a lot of stuff focused on shadow damage. So you could get this. Now you're doing 20% increased shadow damage as well. And then we have Exploit Weakness. Whenever you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they take 1% increased damage from you for 6 seconds up to 15%. So this is something that would be much better for boss killing because you could just keep vulnerable on the boss, keep damaging them, and get up to this 15% damage increase and just keep it up most of the time. This doesn't seem like it's going to be super strong for just killing groups of enemies. Then we have Lorana's Instinct. When Inner Sight's gauge becomes full, you gain 100% dodge chance for 1.5 seconds. Now this is one of the rogue specializations where once you fill up the gauge, you have unlimited energy for 4 seconds. Now this also gives you 100% dodge chance for the first 1.5 seconds, meaning you're going to be ridiculously tanky for those first 1.5 seconds. Then we have No Witnesses. Your ultimate skills deal 30% increased damage and grant you 10% increased damage for 20 seconds when cast. So as mentioned before, especially when going over the preparation specialization, rogues are definitely going to have some builds that are completely focused around ultimate skills. And then finally, we have Tricks of the Trade. Your marksman skills grant your next cutthroat skill 25% increased damage, and your cutthroat skills grant your next marksman skill 25% increased damage. Now marksman skills are all of your range skills, and Cutthroat are your melee skills. So basically, if you have a build using ranged and melee skills, you're going to want to alternate between the two and continuously get some pretty big damage buffs off of this node. And I think the Rogue is probably going to be the most complex class in Diablo 4. Just going over a bunch of the different effects and the way you're going to have to play the Rogue, I think it's generally going to take a bit more skill to fully utilize a lot of the effects and options the Rogue has, but I also think the Rogue just is going to have a ton of options for creating different builds, and I think people who are really into theory crafting are definitely going to gravitate towards the Rogue. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.